Good evening, friend. If you're lying in bed or slouched peacefully into a well-worn chair, perhaps with a cup of something warm and mildly herbal nearby, then you've already made the most important decision of the evening, to let history drift in slowly, like incense from another room. Tonight, we're taking a long, slow walk through ancient Rome, not the Rome of marble arches and victory parades, but the quieter, less heroic side, the legal side, the administrative side, the part with paperwork awkward trials, and occasionally people being gently escorted off cliffs. Now dim your lights, perhaps fluff your pillow just once more, and let your eyelids soften, because it's time to explore the calm, stern world of Roman treason. It begins, as many things do, with someone forgetting their lunch. Our imagined citizen, let's call him Lucius, wakes just before dawn in his narrow insula apartment. The air is gray and filled with the scent of baking barley, bread from the street vendors setting up below. His room is mostly stone, mildly damp, and contains precisely 3 items of value: a small oil lamp, a chipped cup that once belonged to his uncle, and a faded tunic that smells gently of olives and dust. The mattress, if you could call it that, is more a lumpy sack of straw than any proper bed. Still, it's home. And at least it's on the 2nd floor, which means slightly less risk of dying in a cooking fire. Lucius isn't a senator or a soldier. He's a record-keeper's assistant. His job 6 days a week is to walk to the forum, sit quietly behind a wooden desk, and transcribe the names of people accused of minor civic offenses. Things like improper toga folding tax confusion, or accidentally insulting a statue. He uses a wax tablet, a very small knife to sharpen his stylus, and a distinct sense of disappointment inherited from his father. But today, Lucius has been asked to report to a different location, a small tribunal gathering near the Temple of Concord. The note handed to him the previous day reads, "Witness and record testimony. Subject, perduelio. Bring stylus." The word makes him wince. Perduelio, the old term for treason, a word almost no one uses anymore unless they are being very serious or very old-fashioned. Still, Lucius rises, dresses slowly, and packs his wax tablet into a cloth satchel with exactly 2 nuts for lunch. He forgets the bread, a detail that will haunt him around noon. Outside, the streets are damp with morning fog. The paving stones slick with the leftovers of the night's humidity and the occasional dropped fig. He walks past the bakery the public fountain, where a child is arguing with a goat, and the statue of Minerva that someone has once again painted a mustache onto. Rome is waking up. Vendors mutter. Guards shift. Someone shouts about wine. At the Temple of Concord, the scene is oddly calm. A small crowd gathers in a semicircle. The accused, a man named Gaius Festus, stands between two guards with surprisingly neat hair. He is not in chains. That would be unseemly at this hour. But his tunic is plain, his sandals dusty, and his mouth fixed in that very Roman expression of noble resignation. He has been accused quietly of attempting to defraud a minor senator during a shipment of grain. The crime itself is less dramatic than the name of the charge suggests. But Roman treason, as Lucius knows, is a very flexible idea. A judge in a red-trimmed toga speaks softly, asking if Gaius confesses. He does not. He explains, with much waving of the arms, that he merely miscounted crates, that the river barge was overloaded, that mice had eaten half the scrolls. Lucius writes, "Defendant claims grain eaten by rodents. River, conditions unfavorable." There is a polite chuckle from someone behind him, possibly a clerk, possibly a god. The tribunal lasts 3 hours. It is mostly quiet, with the occasional grunt of agreement or the creaking of a stool. No one cries. No one yells. It is not a courtroom, as one might imagine, but more like an especially judgmental picnic. The scrolls are presented. A minor witness, who once watched Gaius sneeze suspiciously, is called. And then, at long last, a judgment is reached. Gaius is found guilty, not of high treason, but of the lesser version. Enough to warrant a consequence, but not enough to upset the city's delicate schedule. The judge considers. And then, in the same tone one might use to order lentils, announces sentence Tarpeian correction. Lucius blinks. He glances at the guard, then back at his tablet. He writes, "Subject to be escorted to Tarpeian Rock. Sentence to be carried out at dusk. No blood to be spilled. Family may collect sandals. The tribunal ends. People disperse. Someone complains about the humidity. Lucius walks slowly home, thinking about the strange finality of cliffs. He still hasn't eaten. Lucius did not return home that afternoon. He had intended, truly he had, but his feet, encased in sandals that were at least one size too thin in the sole, seemed to drift of their own accord, not back toward the insula and its warm corner of damp straw, but instead toward the slow, stone-breathing incline of the Capitoline Hill. There was no order to go, no instruction pinned to his tunic. And yet, something about the phrase Tarpeian correction tugged gently at the hem of his curiosity. It was, after all, not a sentence handed out every day. In fact, in Lucius's limited but reasonably committed career as an assistant record keeper and casual listener of courthouse gossip, he had never personally witnessed one, and so, as the fog of morning gave way to the slightly less damp air of mid-afternoon, and as the city shifted into that peculiar Roman lull between business and dinner, a gap filled mostly with muted arguments and long shadows, Lucius made his way slowly up the ancient path. The Capitoline Hill, for all its historical significance and stern marble neighbors, was not particularly grand in height, more a respectable bump than a true ascent. But its steps uneven and mildly philosophical in their refusal to align required care. As he climbed, Lucius thought about the man from the tribunal, Gaius Festus, a name as unremarkable as a clay jar, yet now destined to echo against the stone of Rome's memory, if only briefly. He wondered if Gaius had family, or debts, or particularly strong feelings about sandals. He wondered if he'd plead again, or if he would go silently with that resigned expression Romans often practiced from childhood, in case they were summoned unexpectedly before a magistrate or a dinner party. The street narrowed as he approached the crest. To his left, the temple of Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus, loomed in the polite but disapproving way temples often do. Its columns, a reminder that while gods might not always interfere, they were most certainly judging. Lucius passed a pair of municipal guards lounging beneath a fig tree, one of whom was slowly unraveling a cheesecloth-wrapped lunch with the same reverence a priest might give a sacred scroll. They did not look up. Everyone knew what time it was. The Tarpeian Rock, contrary to the poetic warnings found in cautionary tales, or the dramatically embroidered murals at certain bathhouses, was not especially fearsome. It was not tall. It was not jagged. It was not surrounded by vultures or carved with ominous inscriptions. It was, in truth, a rather ordinary outcrop of stone, worn down by centuries of weather and pigeon-related contributions, sitting just past a line of sleepy cypress trees and a modest rope barrier installed during the time of Emperor Tiberius to discourage the overly curious. Lucius stood a few paces back. Others had gathered too. Not a crowd, no Rome. Frowned on crowds at judicial events, but a scattering. Some officials, a clerk, an elderly man who may have been lost but seemed politely interested. And just now, arriving the figure of Gaius himself. He was not in chains. This still struck Lucius as odd. Instead, he was escorted by two guards, one of whom, carried what looked like a ceremonial staff, and the other a particularly well-oiled scroll, possibly the sentence itself, or perhaps a grocery list. No one had gotten around to filing. Gaius walked with the slow, steady pace of a man who had long ago finished thinking about how he might have done things differently. His sandals were scuffed, and his tunic had been freshly tied at the waist in what Lucius privately recognized as the "this is fine" knot. When they reached the edge of the outcrop, the guard with the staff nodded to no one in particular. There was a silence, not dramatic, just mildly expectant, a kind of bureaucratic stillness. Lucius realized he was holding his breath, which was unnecessary and slightly performative, so he let it out through his nose like someone trying not to sigh too audibly at a dinner with relatives. Gaius turned slightly, said something to the guard on his left, perhaps a joke or a request to adjust the angle of his descent, and then quite deliberately stepped forward. Not with a lunge, not with drama, but with the resigned grace of a man boarding the wrong boat, knowing full well it's headed to the same river everyone ends up in eventually. There was no scream, just a muted thump, too low to echo. The guards did not move immediately. The silence lingered. Someone coughed. A bird flapped half-heartedly from a tree branch above. And then, without a word, the scroll was rolled up. The staff was lowered, and the small assembly began to disperse like steam from a bathhouse floor. Lucius remained, not out of horror, but out of habit. He took out his wax tablet, inscribed a few quiet words, sentence executed at dusk. Descent, orderly. No blood observed. Dignity maintained. He paused. Added sandals recovered intact. He lingered a moment longer, staring at the rope barrier, the cypress trees, the last sliver of sunlight curling along the stones. Then, tucking the tablet beneath his arm, he turned slowly and began the walk down. The city below was beginning to light its torches. Somewhere near the Forum, someone was probably setting out figs, and though his stomach reminded him quite firmly that he had forgotten his lunch, Lucius found himself walking not toward home, but instead toward the Municipal Records Hall, where a stack of incomplete incident reports and a slightly crooked stool were waiting, and where beneath a dusty window something unexpected had been left earlier that day. The walk back down from the Capitoline Hill took longer than usual, not because Lucius was injured or elderly, but because he had that peculiar Roman habit of walking slowly when thinking, as if each step helped sift the thoughts into something more grammatically manageable. His sandals, now slightly wet from a puddle he had misjudged near the statue of a minor river deity, slapped softly against the stone path, echoing faintly in the near-empty alleys between twilight shadows. The city itself had begun to shift into its evening rhythm, which meant the bread stalls were closed. The fishmongers were swearing poetically about unsold eels, and the torch-bearers were starting their rounds with the usual level of enthusiasm somewhere between distracted and mildly flammable. Lucius passed them without speaking, nodding slightly, as one might toward a neighbor's goat, his mind still weighed down by the image of Gaius Festus stepping calmly into history from the Tarpeian rock, turned now to something smaller, stranger, and entirely more personal: the note. Not the scroll announcing Gaius's sentence, but rather the small, loosely folded parchment that had been left for Lucius hours earlier, now sitting, he hoped, where he had hidden it, beneath a stack of municipal pigeon permits in the records hall. It had no seal, no signature, just the words, "Check shelf 3 box 8, written in a hand that was both firm and suspiciously non-specific. Normally, Lucius would have ignored it. Anonymous notes in Rome were about as common as cracked amphorae or mildly sarcastic gods. But this one had been left on his stool, and it had been tucked rather pointedly beneath his stylus, which in the records hall constituted a breach of personal space only slightly less severe than borrowing someone's wax tablet without asking. By the time he arrived, the records hall was mostly dark, save for the dim flicker of a single oil lamp burning stubbornly near the doorway. It cast a sort of bureaucratic glow over the stacks of tablets, scrolls, and slightly moldy dispatches from regional grain inspectors. The air smelled faintly of parchment vinegar and whatever had recently expired in the ink pot cupboard. Lucius entered quietly out of both habit and superstition and made his way to the third shelf. Box 8. It was an unimpressive wooden container, slightly splintered, labeled with the faded word "Perduelio" in red ink that had long ago surrendered any hopes of legibility. He hesitated, partly because he was tired, and partly because opening any box labeled "Perduelio" after dusk felt like the kind of decision one might later regret in an anecdote. Still, the note had been specific. He lifted the lid. Inside were a series of documents, not the usual grain ledgers or reports on toga thefts, but actual tribunal records. Names, dates, testimonies, and curiously, a small clay tag inscribed with the number 47 and what appeared to be a very detailed etching of a cucumber. Lucius frowned carefully, set the tag aside, and began to sift through the contents. At the bottom of the pile, almost hidden beneath a folded decree concerning seditious pottery, he found a smaller scroll tied with twine. It bore no markings. He untied it slowly, trying not to let the twine fall into the oil lamp, and began to read. The scroll was short. A list of sorts. 4 names. One of them was Gaius Festus. Another name he didn't recognize. The third was scratched out with what looked like considerable force. And the fourth, well, the fourth name was Lucius, his own. Not a rare name, true, but the handwriting matched the note, and it was underlined. He sat very still for a moment, the kind of stillness usually reserved for statues or people trying to avoid being volunteered for military service. Then, slowly, he rolled the scroll back up, tucked it into the sleeve of his tunic, and looked around the records hall, as though expecting it to explain itself. It did not. Records halls rarely do. He stood, stretched his legs quietly, so as not to alarm the paperwork, and stepped outside. The air was cooler now. The street torches had been lit, casting long, flickering shadows across the cobbles. Somewhere in the distance, someone was singing a drinking song in a key that seemed to resent music entirely. Lucius walked toward home. His thoughts tangled like grapevines. He thought of the tribunal, the steady voice of the magistrate, the almost gentle execution of Gaius. He thought of the scroll with his name, and he thought, with growing unease, about the phrase he'd once heard whispered by a slightly drunk municipal clerk. In Rome, everyone's a traitor. They just haven't been scheduled yet. He reached the corner near the baker's shop, paused beneath a flickering torch, and looked back over his shoulder. There was no one there, but a breeze stirred the edge of his tunic, and in the distance, the Temple of Concord stood dark against the sky, its steps quiet, its judgment paused, and its doors not quite. Lucius did not sleep well that night, which was saying something, considering the mattress was a loosely gathered arrangement of straw lint and the occasional pebble that had wandered in and decided to stay. He lay motionless under his woolen blanket, now beginning to take on the scent of both his thoughts and a neighbor's ill-kept laundry eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling above. The clay tag with the cucumber etching kept reappearing in his mind, bouncing between images of the tribunal, the unspoken finality of the Tarpeian Rock, and that list. That damned list. 4 names. 1 scratched out. 1 his own. And the thought that perhaps he had stumbled into a story whose ending had already been shelved somewhere in the archives, written neatly in red ink, and filed under unfortunate but orderly outcomes. When the sun finally pushed its way over the rooftops of the insulae, accompanied, as usual, by the screech of market vendors and the unsettlingly loud wheeze of someone sweeping a step, 3 buildings over, Lucius sat up slowly. His tunic was wrinkled, his knees ached, and his mouth tasted faintly of regret and lentils. But it was morning, which meant duty. And duty in Rome was more important than sleep survival, or even moderately clean sandals. He dressed, fastened the scroll into a cloth wrap under his arm, and made his way once again into the city's living mosaic of sound, odor, and confusion. He decided not to go to the records hall first. Instead, he headed toward a quieter corner of the city, the tabularium. The state archive, a structure that sat beneath the Capitoline Hill, like a thoughtful afterword to the Senate above it, housing records so ancient and disorganized that some clerks had begun referring to it only as the pile. It was not officially open to assistants of his rank, but Lucius had over the years cultivated a modest friendship with an aging archivist named Manius, whose chief qualities included poor eyesight, selective memory, and a tendency to share his bread when asked the right questions. The tabularium loomed ahead. Its wide stone steps rarely swept its bronze doors ajar in the way that suggested both invitation and indifference. Lucius slipped inside. The air was cool and smelled strongly of scroll dust, faded ink, and whatever substance had once been used to polish the floor before giving up. Manius was exactly where he always was, hunched over a table covered in scrolls that looked dangerously close to becoming compost. He wore the same threadbare tunic he had worn every day for a decade, and his expression suggested he had recently argued with a moth and lost. Lucius cleared his throat politely. "Manius," he said softly, "I'm looking for records on tribunal designations, possibly connected to treason assessments, possibly coded under vegetables." Manius blinked once, then twice, then leaned forward, squinting at Lucius as though trying to identify which part of him might be making sense. Vegetables? He echoed his voice like dry paper being folded with intent. Lucius nodded, unwrapping the scroll, just enough to show the clay tag and the etched cucumber. Manius leaned closer, muttered something that may have been figment, and reached blindly behind him toward a shelf containing a series of unlabeled baskets. After rummaging for a moment with the efficiency of someone who had organized things only once in 27 years, he retrieved a second tag, similar in size, but with an etching of what could only be described as an aggressively carved onion. "They used food," Manius said, finally holding it like a sacred text, "to categorize kinds of treason, a system briefly proposed during the Flavian bureaucracy reforms. Didn't catch on." Lucius stared. "Treason. By vegetable." "Symbolic," Manius corrected. "Cucumber cases meant quiet subversion, slow undermining of public confidence. Onions, however, public incitement." Tears, drama, theatrical sedition. Lucius processed this as best he could. And if someone's name appeared with a cucumber, means someone thought they were quietly dangerous, Manius said. The kind of dangerous that files reports, shows up early, and asks too many questions. Lucius didn't respond. He looked down at the scroll, at his name, at the underlining. Manius. He asked slowly, "How does one get off such a list?" Manius shrugged. "You don't, usually, unless you're very useful or very forgettable." Lucius left not long after, mind buzzing like a badly tuned lyre. He passed a bakery, ignored the smell, turned sharply away from a pair of guards he recognized from the tribunal. And instead of heading back to the records hall, he made a sudden decision. He would visit his uncle. Uncle Tullus was technically a retired plumber, but had over the years evolved into something more like a local informant, equal parts advisor, cynic, and enthusiastic collector of municipal gossip. If there was anyone in Rome who could explain what happened to people quietly marked for correction, it was Tullus. Lucius turned down a narrow street, stepped over a cat with political ambitions, and made for the quiet courtyard of his uncle's apartment. But as he approached the doorway, he noticed something odd. The door, usually shut and reinforced with a plank of wood that could stop a chariot, was open. Just slightly, just enough for a breeze to stir the curtain behind it. Lucius hesitated, one foot on the step, one hand tightening on the scroll under his arm. The city sounds behind him seemed to pause, as though waiting for him to move, to speak, to open the door further, or turn away completely. Inside, there was no sound, no voice, no Tullus, just the stillness of a room that had recently been visited by someone who did not believe in cleaning up afterward. And somewhere barely audible, the slow creak of a floorboard that had never creaked before. Lucius froze on the threshold. One hand still pressed lightly against the half-open door, the other cradling the rolled parchment so tightly that the twine bit faintly into his skin. The silence beyond was not the usual kind of silence, the kind that came with naps or reading or afternoon wine, but the sort that settled in rooms that had recently been interrupted and were now unsure whether they were still inhabited or merely abandoned. A single oil lamp flickered near the far wall, casting long, irregular shadows over the cluttered remains of what had once been his uncle Tullus's carefully arranged work table. The tools, chisels, clamps, curved bits of pipe, and several items whose function had always been vaguely speculative, were still there, though now jumbled like they'd been swept by a careless hand or an urgent one. Lucius stepped in slowly, allowing the door to creak wider behind him, and waited. Still no sound, no voice, no sarcastic cough or familiar thud of his uncle knocking something over while reaching for a stale fig. Just the creak again, low and rhythmic. Not the sound of a person moving, but something swinging softly, as if caught in a breeze that had chosen this room for its theater. He crossed the threshold fully now, feet treading carefully on the worn stone tiles, eyes scanning for anything out of place. The curtain that separated the sleeping alcove from the main room hung partially drawn, and behind it he could just make out a shifting shape, slow, repetitive, swaying gently, like laundry caught in wind, only heavier and less forgiving. Lucius paused, pressed his lips into a line, then reached forward and pulled the curtain aside with one deliberate motion. There was no breeze. The window was shut, and there, suspended from a ceiling beam, with the kind of knot that looked too professional to be accidental, hung a bundle of rope and cloth that at first glance could have been mistaken for a sack. But it wasn't a sack. It was Tullus. Not obviously wounded, not contorted or grotesque, just hanging limp and oddly still, as if he had simply run out of standing. His eyes were closed, his face calm. Almost too calm, as though someone had taken the time to arrange it. On the small table beneath the beam lay a stool tipped neatly onto its side, and beside it a single copper coin. Not a suicide offering, Lucius thought immediately. Not in this case. No wine cup, no scattered papers, no farewell scrolls. Just the coin, which seemed too precisely placed, too symbolic. He recognized the trick. This was a message. And worse, it was one his uncle would have recognized too if he hadn't been the message. Lucius backed away slowly, bumping into the wall, nearly knocking over a brass cup that had somehow remained upright amid the quiet wreckage. He steadied it, breathing now, through his mouth, the way you do when you realize the room you're in has changed from familiar to dangerous in the span of a thought. There were no guards, no signs of forced entry, just the tidy kind of disorder left by someone who had time to leave things almost as they were, and yet had made sure you would notice something was wrong. Lucius crouched beside the overturned stool, examining it more closely. The leg had been cracked recently, not in a fall, but split deliberately. Beneath it, tucked into the hollow base, he found a folded square of parchment, just large enough to be concealed, but just obvious enough to be found, if someone knew where to look. He unfolded it. The handwriting was his uncle's, rushed, and slightly slanted. It read, "If you're reading this, it means they decided. I asked too much. I remembered too well. The list is older than you think. Watch for figs. They mark their own. Don't trust anyone wearing green today. Lucius read it 3 times. The words they decided echoed oddly, as though the subject of the sentence was known to everyone, but never named aloud. The note was unsigned, but unnecessary. Toulouse had always joked about conspiracies, the way a sailor jokes about drowning, frequently dryly, and with a touch of truth. But now it wasn't a joke. It was rope, and coins, and a stool with a cracked leg. He stood suddenly aware of the weight of the scroll under his arm, the one with his name on it. Still there, still tightly wrapped. A list of 4 names, one scratched out. Gaius Festus, himself, and 2 others. One perhaps had already been handled, the other unknown. And now apparently green tunics were not to be trusted. That narrowed things not at all. This was Rome. Half the civil service wore green. He took the coin from the table, turning it over in his palm. Not standard minting. An old commemorative piece, possibly Claudian. On one side, the head of the emperor. On the other, a fig tree. So that was the symbol. Figs. Not cucumbers, not onions, but figs. Lucius slipped the coin into his belt pouch and moved to the window, drawing the shutter just enough to peer through. The street below was calm. A cart passed by its driver, humming something off-key. A pair of boys tossed a ball made from bound leather strips, and across the alley, at a shaded stall near the fountain, stood a fruit seller, whose cart was stacked neatly, too neatly, with nothing but figs. He wasn't watching Lucius, not directly, but he was facing the building, and his tunic was unmistakably green. Not bright, not flashy, but green enough to be noticed now. Lucius let the shutter fall back into place, heart thrumming in that particular rhythm reserved for people who have seen just enough to realize they are still being seen in return. He stepped back into the room, cast one final look at his uncle, then picked up the folded parchment, tucked it carefully inside his belt, and slipped out the door without letting it creak. Outside, the street looked exactly as it had minutes before. The cart, the boys, the fig vendor. But Lucius now saw it all through a thinner lens, one stretched by rope, fear, and names carved silently into clay tags. He turned left instead of right, taking the alley that led toward the older district, away from the markets and the municipal buildings, away from scrolls and tribunals, toward someone he hadn't seen in 3 years, whose name he'd promised never to say aloud again, but whose memory now pressed into his thoughts like the edge of a knife. Lucius moved quickly now, or at least as quickly as a man could without drawing attention in a city where running was generally reserved for thieves, messengers, or people trying to avoid fresh civic taxes. The alley twisted behind him in a series of damp, stone-hemmed curves, each corner smelling faintly of vinegar cats or the afterthought of garlic. His mind reeled with what he'd just seen, the coin, the message, the way his uncle had been arranged, with such quiet finality, like an inventory item set aside after expiration. But most of all, the green tunic fig vendor with his careful cart and his watchful stillness. It wasn't paranoia anymore, not after seeing his name on a scroll and his uncle on a rope. It was protocol. Lucius ducked through a narrow archway leading into the Subura, a lower-class district known more for noise than nuance, where anonymity came as naturally as dust. Here, laundry hung between windows, shouting was considered part of the morning liturgy, and no one looked too closely at anyone unless they were bleeding or famous. He passed a baker selling loaves that could double as weapons, and a scribe loudly arguing with a parrot. These were good signs. Chaos was comforting here. He took a right down a stairway, carved more by foot traffic than intention, and paused briefly at a fountain shaped like a lion chewing on something ambiguous. He looked left, then right, then stepped through a crooked doorway tucked behind a dye shop that smelled like failure and marigolds. The interior of the building was dim and smelled of wax and old wool, which was to Lucius a promising combination. He walked past 3 empty stools and a sleeping goat before reaching a low door at the rear. No sign, no bell, just a small piece of red thread nailed into the lintel, its edges frayed, like it had been worrying about something. Lucius knocked twice, then once more, then paused. A soft sound answered, not a voice, but a cough, short and deliberate. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room beyond was small and low-ceilinged, its walls lined with shelves, holding everything from scrolls and broken statues to jars labeled dust and other dust. A single oil lamp hung from a hook shaped like a fish. At the center sat a woman in a robe the color of wet rope, her hair coiled into a bun that had clearly started with purpose and ended in resignation. She was reading a parchment that seemed to disapprove of being read. Without looking up, she said, "Lucius, you've aged." Lucius gave a humorless smile. "And you're still hiding behind jars. Better jars than tribunal benches?" she replied, finally, lifting her eyes to meet his. Her name was Calpurnia, though she hadn't used it in years, preferring aliases like Thea Verus, and once, inexplicably, Figsandra. They had once shared a rooftop argument during a census protest and hadn't spoken since a disagreement involving forged permissions and a cart of badly mislabeled olives. But trust in Rome was less about fondness and more about knowing someone who owed you an explanation. Lucius held up the scroll. "I'm on a list," he said. "You were always on a list," she replied, standing. "The question is whether it's the kind with ink or the kind with rope." "This one had both," he said. "And fruit. Cucumber. Then fig." That caught her attention. She reached for the scroll, her fingers quick but deliberate. She scanned it once, then again, then dropped it onto the table like it had insulted her lineage. "That's not just a tribunal record," she muttered. "That's a dispatch log. Internal. Cloaked. Cross-referenced through vegetable code. They're using it again." "Who's they?" Lucius asked, though he knew the answer would be vague and unsatisfying. Calpurnia didn't answer directly. Instead, she pulled a worn satchel from beneath the table, rifled through its contents, and produced an old clay seal. It bore the image of a scale slightly off balance, and the inscription Ordo Frumentari. Lucius squinted. "The grain order." She snorted. "That's what the Senate thinks. The Frumentari haven't handled grain in decades. They handle lists. The kind of lists where names get removed, not alphabetically." "They marked me," Lucius said quietly. "And Tullus." She nodded. "And you saw a fig cart parked, watching." "Then they're close," she said, already rewrapping the scroll in a cloth. "Too close. If they're posting vendors, it means observation has shifted to containment. That puts you in the third stage. Third. First is suspicion. Second is tagging. Third is shaping." Lucius frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means they are not just watching anymore. They're moving things around you, removing anchors, closing options, preparing a version of events that makes your disappearance seem like a footnote." She moved to the shelves, pulled down a small iron box, and flipped it open. Inside was a bundle of forged permits, a set of wax tablets, and a ring stamped with an unfamiliar family crest. "Take these," she said. "Go to the southern baths. There's a man named Gellius. Tell him your uncle has retired to the countryside, and the figs have ripened early. He'll give you something else, papers, likely, and a name to wear that won't match your face. Do not argue. Do not linger. And for Jupiter's sake, don't buy any fruit." Lucius took the box without comment. His hands were steady now, his thoughts sharper. The world was still wobbling slightly, but the pieces had begun to move in a pattern. Not one he liked, but one he could follow. He turned toward the door, but Calpurnia stopped him. "If they already have you in the shaping phase," she said quietly, "you'll start noticing odd things. People forgetting you, records missing, coins turning up where they shouldn't. And if I see another fig cart," he asked. "You're out of time," she replied. Lucius nodded once and stepped back into the street. The alley was quieter now. The fig vendor was gone. In his place stood a woman selling boiled nuts, her cart covered in a neutral gray cloth. He passed her without looking, took a side street, then another, until the city blurred into that half-remembered maze he used to navigate as a boy. He clutched the satchel close, the words "containment" and "footnote" ticking softly in his ears. The southern baths loomed ahead now, the steam rising in gentle clouds. But the entrance, normally bustling, stood oddly silent. And just inside the archway of the southern baths, stood a figure who did not belong. Not in the usual way that bathhouse patrons might seem out of place. Someone overdressed, perhaps, or someone who had clearly confused the caldarium for a fish market, but in a quieter, more deliberate sense. He was leaning against the pillar, as though he had done so 100 times before, yet his eyes were still moving slow and calculating, scanning the open air, the way a fisherman scans the surface of water just before a tug on the line. Lucius slowed his pace without stopping. The man's tunic was the brownish gray of overwashed linen, but there was a faint pattern on the sleeve. 3 vertical lines stitched in red thread, so faded they might have been mistakes unless one knew to look. Calpurnia had said nothing about 3 lines. She had mentioned a man named Gellius, a phrase about figs and uncles and ripening schedules, and had warned not to buy fruit. But she hadn't said anything about waiting men or silent sentinels who watched archways like they were thresholds between versions of reality. Lucius kept walking, slipping into the bathhouse through a side entrance where a bored-looking boy was sweeping steam into corners. The baths were quieter than usual, though not entirely empty. A pair of older men were arguing softly near the frigidarium, their robes draped neatly over a bench as though worried about wrinkles. A woman poured water into a basin, humming something that might have been a lullaby or a legal disclaimer. Lucius passed them all, careful not to look rushed, and made his way toward the rear, where a row of mosaic columns framed a courtyard that rarely drew attention. It was here, beyond the edge of the warm pools and idle chatter, that he found Gellius, or at least someone who appeared to fit the description Calpurnia had implied. Tall, heavy-set, with the kind of expression that suggested he had once wrestled a boar, and then politely apologized afterward. He was carving a peach with a short knife, the slices falling one by one into a bowl balanced on his knee. Lucius approached, cleared his throat, and recited carefully, "My uncle has retired to the countryside, and the figs have ripened early this year." Gellius did not look up. He continued carving the blade, moving with slow, almost reverent precision. "Has he taken the goat with him?" Lucius blinked. "No," he said. The goat remained. There was a rope issue. That seemed to satisfy the man. He set the knife down, wiped his hands on a cloth that had once been white, and stood. "Come," he said. No introduction, no questions, just motion. Lucius followed him through a narrow corridor that led behind the hypocausts, past stacks of firewood and jars of oils no one had used since the reign of Tiberius. The floor sloped downward uneven stone, giving way to packed earth. The air grew cooler, drier, and tinged with the scent of old parchment and older secrets. They emerged into a chamber that might once have stored amphorae, but now served as something else entirely. Tables lined the walls, covered in scrolls, maps, wax tablets, and small piles of strange coins. A curtain of heavy cloth hung across one side, and behind it came the soft rustle of someone pacing. Gellius turned to Lucius, handed him a folded tunic, a colorless, nondescript garment with no markings, and said, "You'll wear this. Your name is now Marius Septimus. You're an apprentice lampright from Beneventum. Quiet, polite, partial to goats." "Still with the goats," Lucius muttered. "Everyone remembers goats," Gellius said, with a shrug. "No one questions them." He moved to a small chest and retrieved a set of identification tablets, pre-scribed, sealed and slightly warm, as though they'd been finished minutes earlier. "These are yours. Show them to no one unless you absolutely must. If they ask about your past, you've been sick. If they ask about your work, mention soot. If they ask about your favorite food, say lentils. No one likes lentils. No one lies about them." Lucius nodded, slipping into the new tunic as he spoke. "And what about the man outside?" At the archway, Gellius frowned. 3 red lines on his sleeve. Lucius confirmed. "He's a tether. Watches the exits. Makes sure no one leaves until the page is turned." "Page. Your life," Gellius said. "The version where you were. Lucius assistant clerk, suspicious, nephew friend of inconvenient archivists. That page is over. From now on, you're Marius. You eat lentils, you make lamps, You do not talk to men wearing figs, and you never, ever mention cucumbers. And what if I do? Lucius asked. Then someone writes your name on a page, Gellius said, and the rest is rope. The curtain rustled again. A woman stepped out. Her face was lined, her gaze sharp, and her hair braided in a style that suggested a military past. She said nothing, just handed Lucius a small bundle, food by the smell of it, and a flask of water sealed with wax. You have until dusk, she said. Then the window closes. You'll take the east road through the olive grove. There's a turnoff marked by a statue missing its nose. Wait there. Someone will find you. And if no one comes? Lucius asked. Then you'll keep walking, she replied, until you find someone who does. Gellius placed a hand on Lucius's shoulder. This isn't exile, he said. It's suspension. You're not gone. Just paused. Until we know more. Lucius breathed in. The room smelled of dust and purpose. He took the bundle, the flask, the tablets. His old name clung faintly to the inside of his ribs, like a label on a discarded tunic. He turned toward the exit, but paused. If the list is older than we thought, he said, slowly, does that mean it's still growing? The woman gave a tired smile. It's Rome, she said. All lists grow. Lucius stepped back into the corridor, the lamplight behind him dimming as he climbed toward the baths. The noise returned gradually, splashing water. Low voices, the faint thud of sandals on wet stone. He emerged near the furnace, nodded once to Gellius, who had followed only to the threshold, then stepped outside. The man with the 3 red lines was gone. In his place, leaning against the same pillar, was a child holding a basket of lentils, humming quietly. Lucius said nothing, did not slow, and walked into the street as the sun began to stretch across the rooftops, its long shadows pointing him southeast. Somewhere ahead, a statue without a nose waited in silence. And just beyond that, somewhere beyond the olive grove, past the outer ring of cracked marble statues and the half-forgotten footpaths where goats occasionally roamed without purpose or supervision. Lucius, now dressed as Marius, Septimus humble lampright of Beneventum, walked with the steady rhythm of someone trying very hard not to be noticed. The bundle tucked beneath his arm was light but bulky, made awkward by the occasional clink of the flask pressing against what he hoped was bread, and not some symbolic item meant to make sense later. The east road was quiet, just as Calpurnia and Gellius had promised, lined on one side by a slowly decaying aqueduct, and on the other by wild rosemary and sleeping bees. Here, at the edge of the city, where the noise thinned into gentle muttering, and the wind carried only hints of olive brine and soil, Lucius began to feel, for the first time in many days, like perhaps no one was watching. It was a temporary illusion, of course. Even the road seemed aware of him, its stones warm underfoot, humming faintly with the friction of too many sandals, too many stories layered like dried wax on a forgotten tablet. He rounded a bend and saw it, at last, the statue without a nose. It was as predicted, slightly hunched, perhaps from erosion, perhaps from embarrassment. The missing nose gave the marble senator an expression of long-suffering confusion, like someone who had been handed a scroll upside down and didn't wish to cause offense by asking. Lucius approached cautiously. The turnoff was barely marked, just a narrow split in the road that curled into a stand of trees where the path seemed more imagined than paved. He stood beside the statue, leaned against its base, and waited. Time passed. Not quickly, but in the way it often does when one is alone and deeply uncertain. He counted the clouds, noticed the ants, listened to the trees whisper about nothing in particular. The sun slid downward, like a bureaucrat avoiding eye contact, just as he began to consider the possibility that this might all have been an elaborate misunderstanding involving olives and paranoia. He heard the sound of hooves, not fast, not galloping, but the unhurried plodding of a cart horse who had opinions about the journey. Lucius stepped back into the shadows as a small cart appeared around the bend, drawn by a single mule, and guided by a driver who looked as though he had never once hurried in his life. He wore a broad straw hat and chewed what might have been a reed, or an especially optimistic worm. The cart was loaded with barrels, all sealed, all unmarked. The driver did not stop immediately. He let the cart roll forward until it was even with the statue, then pulled gently on the reins. The mule stopped with a sigh. The driver looked straight ahead and said in a tone so flat it could have been hammered, "If you're Marius, climb in. If you're not, enjoy the weather." Lucius hesitated only long enough to scan the road once more, then climbed onto the cart, settling among the barrels that smelled faintly of vinegar and secrets. The driver clicked his tongue. The cart moved. For several minutes, neither spoke. The road narrowed. The trees leaned in. Eventually, the driver said, "You look more like a Lucius." Lucius stiffened. "And you sound more like a tax collector," he replied, hoping the sarcasm would camouflage the fear. The driver chuckled once, a sound like two rocks bumping into each other in a dry well. "Relax," he said. "I don't do names." I do routes. And your route has just changed. Lucius looked over. Changed how? There's been an adjustment. The Olive Grove rendezvous is burned. Someone talked or sneezed too loudly. Hard to say. Lucius cursed under his breath. So what now? Now, said the driver, we take the barrels to a bathhouse in Fidenai. You get out there. Someone else meets you. Probably with another name, possibly with a different profession. Maybe you're a cobbler next time. I don't know how to make shoes, Lucius muttered. No one will ask. The driver replied, Cobblers the new lentils. Utterly uninteresting. The cart rolled on. The sun dipped lower, casting the trees into silhouettes that resembled tired philosophers. The road widened briefly, then narrowed again, as they entered a patch of forest where the light struggled to make decisions. Lucius tried to relax, but his mind kept replaying Tullus's final message, the quiet authority in Calpurnia's voice, and that cursed scroll with the 4 names. Was this what happened to all of them? A slow dissolving into aliases and carts, new clothes, and fewer choices. He looked at the barrels, wondering what they actually carried. The scent was oddly familiar. Vinegar, yes, but with something metallic beneath it. Not wine, not fish. Something sharper. What's in the barrels? He asked. The driver did not answer immediately. Then, with a shrug, said ink. For record keeping. That's a lot of ink. There's a lot of record to keep. Lucius was silent after that. The driver did not speak again. The cart continued through the thickening woods, the air growing cooler, the wind carrying less scent and more suspicion. A bird called out once, then stopped, as if second-guessing itself. Just before the road curved into a narrow tunnel of overgrown hedges, the driver reached into his cloak and handed Lucius a folded strip of parchment. Don't open it until you're alone, he said, and don't lose it. There's a number on it. Memorize it. Then burn it. Lucius took the parchment, tucked it into his tunic, and nodded. Ahead, the trees began to thin. Lanterns flickered in the distance, tiny lights dancing like uncertain fireflies. Fidene was near. So was the bathhouse. So was whatever came next. The barrels shifted slightly as the cart hit a rut, and Lucius thought, not for the first time that week, about how much of life seemed to depend on where one stood when the list was written. He braced himself as the cart turned toward the lamps, the trees parting, to reveal a low, domed structure ringed with steam and silence. And just outside its main entrance stood a man holding a small wooden box marked with a symbol Lucius had seen only once before, etched into a coin beside his dead uncle's hand. The symbol on the wooden box was unmistakable. Though it had taken Lucius, now still, technically, Marius Septimus, apprentice lamplight, and cobbler in training, several long seconds to place it. A fig tree delicately etched its roots, curling like cautious fingers into the wood, and at its base a pair of sandals crossed not in defiance, but in quiet resignation. It was the same mark that had been carved into the coin left beside Tullus, the same fruit that seemed to follow him like an omen, sticky and sweet, and entirely unwelcome. The man holding the box was neither large nor small, dressed in the manner of someone who believed very firmly in the power of linen and discretion. His beard was trimmed to a width suggesting moderate competence, and his eyes were pale and unbothered, like someone who had never been late to anything in his life. He said nothing as the cart approached, simply turned the box slightly, as if to confirm that Lucius had seen it, understood, it accepted whatever it implied. The driver clicked his tongue, and the mule slowed. "This is your stop," he muttered, not turning his head. Lucius climbed down, boots scraping the packed earth, and nodded once in the driver's direction. "Thank you," he said, meaning it more than he expected. "Don't thank me yet," the driver replied. "You haven't heard what's in the box." And with that, the cart rolled away the barrels, clinking softly like disapproving coins, the mule's ears twitching, as if it had just remembered something unfortunate. Lucius stood for a moment at the edge of the bathhouse, steam curling lazily from the vents in the roof, a faint smell of warmed limestone and boiled herbs hanging in the air like advice. The man with the box stepped forward. "Come," he said, voice clipped, but not unkind. "We'll speak inside. The walls are thicker there." Lucius followed. The bathhouse was nearly empty, its usual clientele absent or moved along, perhaps cleared as part of whatever quiet coordination allowed these transitions to occur without fuss. The atrium echoed with the hollow drip of water, and the floor tiles were arranged in a mosaic pattern that resembled if one squinted a map of a city that had never existed. The man led him through a series of narrow doorways past the tepidarium and the now empty frigidarium into a private chamber, set low into the structure, insulated by stone and time. There were no lamps here, just the soft glow of a single brazier and the flicker of torchlight reflecting off polished tile. The man set the box down on a table and finally introduced himself. "I'm Silvanus," he said, "and you are whoever you were told to be. Doesn't matter much now?" Lucius nodded. "Marius Septimus, apprentice lamplight, formerly lentil enthusiast." Silvanus did not smile. He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in layers of fine cloth, was a scroll case carved from bone, bound with 2 iron clasps. each marked not with the fig tree, but with something else. An olive branch wrapped around a set of scales, unbalanced. Lucius leaned closer. That's not the same mark. No, Silvanus agreed. This predates the figs. Older code. From the days when treason was more of an academic subject. And what's inside? Lucius asked. Records, Silvanus replied. Names, movements, assignments. Some of them false, some of them wishful thinking, but all connected to the list. Not the one you saw. The list behind the list. Lucius blinked. There's a deeper list. There's always a deeper list, Silvanus said, beginning to unclasp the scroll case. The one you were on, that's the outer layer. Those are the names that get handed over to tribunals, or to fig vendors, or to men with ropes and reasonable handwriting. But this, he opened the scroll case. The parchment inside was tightly rolled, sealed at intervals, with blobs of wax, each marked with a tiny fruit symbol. Not just figs, not just cucumbers, grapes, apples, even, bizarrely, a turnip. Silvanus unrolled the first section, carefully exposing a column of names, each paired with a date, a symbol, and a short note in spidery script. Lucius scanned the list. Some names were crossed out. Some had arrows pointing sideways. Some had been rewritten in a different hand entirely. One name, halfway down, made his breath catch Tullus. Next to it, a turnip, the note unstable. Watched too closely. Removed before harvest. Lucius swallowed. What does the fruit mean? They are classifications, Silvanus said. Behavioral forecasts. Figs mean quiet influence. Cucumber is subversion through routine. Grapes tend to be charmers, social threats. Apples are symbolic idealists. Turnips. He paused. Turnips are dangerous, mostly because no one knows what to do with them. They just keep turning up. Lucius stared. So, what am I? Silvanus pointed. There. You were a cucumber. But now look again. Lucius found his name, or rather one of them. Not Lucius, not Marius, but the full name he hadn't used since childhood, one written in precise, elegant script. Beside it, a fig. The note read, converted, active, under observation, placement pending. Converted, Lucius asked. They've reclassified you, Silvanus said, which means they either want to use you or they want to see how you behave now that you know they're watching. So I'm not safe. Silvanus shook his head. There's no safe anymore, only observed and forgotten. And right now, you're still very much observed. Lucius looked back at the scroll. Another name caught his eye. Calpurnia. Beside it, not a fruit, but a broken twig. The note, inactive, retired, awaiting conclusion. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt final. Too final. He stepped back from the table. So what do I do now? Sylvanus closed the scroll case. You wait. And when they come, because they will, you go with them. Not like before, not in chains, but as someone they think might be useful. You nod. You listen. You become part of the fig grove. And from there, he trailed off. You'll understand. Understand what Lucius asked. How the real sentences get written, Sylvanus said, and who holds the stylus. The brazier flickered. Somewhere above the bathhouse murmured with the sound of distant water. Sylvanus opened a side door. Your next name is being prepared. Wait here. Don't speak unless spoken to. And if anyone offers you fruit, don't eat it. Just nod and say, too ripe for me. That's the new passphrase. Lucius nodded, stepping into the smaller chamber, the wooden box now closed behind him, the fig tree still etched into its surface. The door shut gently, sealing him in with nothing but silence, torchlight, and the slow, creeping awareness that deeper lists had deeper roots. And somewhere on the other side of that wall, a new name was being carved for him with careful hands. The chamber Lucius now found himself in was small, windowless, and dry in a way that felt intentional rather than natural, as though someone had once ordered the humidity to leave, and it had politely obeyed. The walls were stone, smoothed over with plaster that had begun to flake in polite, uninterested patches. A single stool sat in the corner, its seat worn into the shape of someone else's indecision, and overhead, a narrow ventilation shaft allowed in just enough air to suggest that someone remembered people needed to breathe. Lucius sat. He didn't sigh, not out of stoicism, but because the silence was too symmetrical, too curated, as though a sigh might throw the whole room into disarray. Somewhere behind the wall, Sylvanus had returned to his box, and his scrolls, continuing whatever task required fig trees, coded fruits, and unnervingly specific handwriting. Lucius reached into his tunic and pulled out the folded parchment the cart driver had given him. He hadn't forgotten it, quite the opposite. It had sat beneath his ribs all this time like a second heartbeat. He unfolded it carefully. Inside, in small, neat lettering, was a number 19 to 47. Beneath it, a single word, capax. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he memorized it. Then he burned it using a stub of candle left by the stool, the flame flickering with mild interest as the parchment curled into ash. Capax. The word meant capable or spacious, depending on context, one of those Latin words that meant something different depending on who said it and whether or not they were holding a sword. He mouthed it once, then let it settle in the back of his mind where it could ferment. Time passed. He could not say how much. The chamber held no windows, no clock, no water clock, not even the slow drip of condensation to measure change. Eventually, the door opened with the kind of quiet that came from oil and experience. A man stepped inside, tall, lean, dressed in robes that bore no insignia, but smelled faintly of charcoal and clove. His face was narrow, his eyes the kind that suggested he had once taught logic, and then grown deeply disappointed in his students. "Stand," the man said, not unkindly. Lucius stood. "Your designation is changing," the man said. "You've been noted, not confirmed. There is now a wedge between your old identity and your use." "What does that mean?" Lucius asked. The man gestured for him to follow. "It means you are now Capax. You will not ask questions. You will carry. That is all." They stepped into a new hallway, one tiled in dark green stone, lit by torches placed in careful intervals. The air was warmer here, heavier. As they walked, Lucius noticed doors, each identical, each marked only with a symbol. A bird, a coin, a scroll, a mask. The man stopped at a door with a keyhole shaped like a stylized eye. "You will wait in here," he said. "Inside is a box. You will carry that box to a place you will be told. You will not open it. You will not speak of it. You will hand it over, then return here. If asked what you carry, you will say, 'Documents for the census.' If pressed, you will say nothing at all." Lucius nodded. "And if I'm stopped by someone official?" "Say you're late," the man replied. "Everyone understands lateness." He unlocked the door and stepped aside. Lucius entered. The room was slightly larger than the previous one, better lit, and entirely empty, except for a box sitting on a pedestal in the center. The box was wooden plane, secured with leather straps, and a wax seal bearing the fig symbol, again, but smaller this time, almost hidden in the crease. Lucius walked to it, placed one hand on the strap, and waited. After a moment, he lifted the box. It was heavier than it looked. Not impossibly so, but with the kind of weight that suggested layers, perhaps a lead lining, or simply the kind of psychological heft that came from not knowing what one was now trusted to carry. As he held it, the door reopened. The man reappeared. The exit is to your left. You'll follow the corridor until you see a statue of Minerva holding a scroll. Turn right. There, someone will meet you. They'll say, "It's late for census delivery." You will reply, "Then we best not delay it further." If they say anything else, you walk away. You never heard them. You do not look back. Understood, Lucius said. Capax, the man corrected. Lucius nodded again. Capax. He stepped into the corridor, the box warm against his palms, the leather straps creaking slightly as he adjusted them. The green tiles passed by in rhythmic repetition, torchlight playing across the floor like whispered warnings. He passed 2 doors, a carved basin filled with dry leaves, and a wall mosaic depicting the goddess Fortuna dropping a coin into a well with great indifference. Then the statue, Minerva, proud and unreadable, scroll in hand, gaze fixed on a future only she could interpret. He turned right. The corridor opened into a small courtyard, the kind reserved for quiet conversations and unremarkable departures. A woman stood there, cloaked her hands, hidden her face, mostly shadowed beneath her hood. "It's late for census delivery," she said, voice calm. Lucius or Capax replied, "Then we best not delay it further." She nodded. "Follow me." They stepped into the outer street, the sun now low and tilting westward. The city hummed around them, unaware or uninterested. People moved carts, rolled arguments, sprouted like weeds. And Lucius walked behind her, the box held close, the fig seal hidden by his grip. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't ask what was in the box. He simply followed step by step, away from the bathhouse, away from names, into a street he had never seen before, toward a door that was already half open. The door was old, but well cared for, its hinges silent as the woman pushed it open fully and gestured for Lucius, still wearing the borrowed name of Capax, still carrying the box that might contain anything from secret orders to extremely well-preserved fruit, to enter ahead of her. He stepped inside. The space beyond was dimly lit and smelled faintly of parchment clay and dried mint. It was not a residence, nor quite a shop, but rather something in between a room shaped by bureaucracy and long-forgotten functions. Shelves lined the walls, each crammed with clay tablets, scroll fragments, and small wooden drawers that rattled faintly with the weight of whatever unimportant detail they had been assigned to remember. A single desk stood at the far end, draped in a cloth that bore the outline of many objects once left too long in place. On a nearby stool sat an older man with hands like cracked leather and a tunic too large for his narrow frame. He looked up as Lucius entered, then nodded once, as if greeting an old acquaintance who had arrived exactly when expected. "Set the box there," he said, pointing to the desk. Lucius did. The wood of the box thudded softly against the surface, and something inside shifted with a dull weight, like pebbles rolling over each other at the bottom of a shallow stream. The older man stood, approached, examined the seal without touching it. "Good," he said. "Intact. That's rare." The woman stepped in behind Lucius and closed the door. He used the phrase properly, she said. Didn't hesitate. "Better than the last," the man muttered. That one tried to wink. Twice. Lucius remained still. "Do I ask now, or is that frowned upon?" The man glanced at him. "You're Capax." "Capax doesn't ask. Capax carries." Lucius gave a small, dry smile. "Then I'll carry on." The man almost chuckled. "A little wit is dangerous, but you'll need it where you're going." He turned to a drawer, pulled out a thin tablet covered in shorthand notations, then reached for a strip of cloth dyed a gray, so unremarkable it seemed to absorb attention. He wrapped it around Lucius's left wrist. "You're marked now," he said. "Officially unofficial. This lets the right people ignore you. Wear long sleeves when around senators. Some of them still read." "And the box?" Lucius asked. "You'll deliver another," the man said. "Not today, but soon." "That was your test. Now comes the purpose." "And what is that?" Lucius asked. The woman answered this time. "You will observe, and you will remember." "That's it?" Lucius asked. "That's all anyone does." "Really," she said. "But most people forget afterward." The man handed Lucius a small pouch inside a coin, another strip of cloth, and a dried fig. "Don't eat that," he said. "It's symbolic." Lucius nodded. "I'm collecting symbols these days." The woman stepped forward. "You're going to a gathering," she said. "Tonight, near the old theater, the one the roof fell in on. There'll be vendors, music, a small play, pretending to be satire, but mostly just noise. Your job is simple. Walk. Listen. Count how many people wear the same gray thread on their wrist. Don't speak to them. Don't signal. Just count. And remember. And if someone speaks to me, lie," she said. "Everyone else will be." Lucius left, not long after the pouch tucked beneath his belt, the fig pressing uncomfortably against his hip like an overly familiar metaphor. The streets had begun to swell again, with late-day movement, the kind that made everything louder and somehow less urgent. He moved with purpose, but not speed, blending in the way city folk do when they don't want their errands questioned. When he reached the theater, an ancient, partially collapsed shell that now served as an impromptu gathering spot for orators, singers, and people who sold things from baskets. It was nearly sunset. The crowd was modest, but growing. A man recited laws no one followed. A child balanced on an overturned amphora, juggling 2 figs and what looked like a beet. A woman nearby sold woven sandals that were all left-footed. Lucius walked, slowly, deliberately. He looked at wrists. Most were bare. Some bore jewelry. A few were wrapped in colored cloth, red, blue, green, but none matched his. Not at first. Then, just beyond a stall, selling overcooked lentils and underpriced metaphors, he saw one. A man pretending to study pottery. Gray thread. Simple knot. Facing east. Lucius kept walking. 10 paces later, another. A woman handing out satirical pamphlets shaped like fish. Thread tucked under a bangle. Eyes scanning, never resting. He walked the full perimeter of the crowd. Counted 6. Then 8. Then near a juggler with an irritating voice. 10. They were scattered evenly, never close enough to be a group. Never obvious. But they were there, all watching, all quiet, all marked. As he completed his second lap, a performer on a raised crate launched into a parody of the Senate, complete with fake scrolls and exaggerated complaints about grain tariffs. Laughter rippled. Lucius joined in half-heartedly, then stepped behind a stall, selling herbs, and out into a side alley, narrow and cool. He leaned against the wall, counted again in his head. 10. No 11. 1 had been walking. Gray thread quickly glimpsed. 11 watchers, 11 witnesses, and now 1 more him. Behind him, the crowd continued laughter and shouting, mixing with the growing hum of evening. He reached into his pouch and touched the strip of cloth, the coin, the fig. Then he turned down the alley, away from the light footsteps, echoing just softly enough to remind him that memory was a heavy thing. And just ahead, where the alley bent slightly to the right, a silhouette waited. The silhouette did not move when Lucius approached, and for a brief moment he considered the possibility that it was nothing more than a trick of torchlight and uneven stone, a crate draped in forgotten cloth, perhaps, or a merchant's cloak left hanging in an act of mild abandonment. But as he drew closer, the figure tilted its head ever so slightly, the kind of motion that carried no threat, but announced a quiet awareness. Lucius slowed his pace, allowing the hush of the alley to thicken around him, the laughter and trumpet-blown mockery from the theater now muted by distance and stone. The figure stepped forward. A man, tall hooded, one hand resting lightly on the curve of his hip, as if uncertain whether to reach for a scroll or simply his balance. His tunic was dark, worn, and perfectly nondescript. Only his wrist bore any color, a single band of gray cloth nearly identical to Lucius's own. They faced each other in the half-light of the alley's curve. Two fragments of some deeper ledger measured and aligned. "Capax," the man said, his voice low, "and even you are not to be here." Yet, Lucius hesitated. "I wasn't told to avoid this alley. No one tells you to breathe, either," the man replied. "But you do it. If you wish to remain unrecorded tonight, turn back. If you wish to be useful, follow." Lucius considered his options, which were few, and none of them inspiring. He nodded. The man turned, not waiting, and led him deeper into the twisting veins of the alley network that coiled behind the collapsed theater like intestines forgotten by city planners. They passed doors that looked asleep, stairwells too narrow for confident climbing, and windows that blinked once and then pretended not to have noticed. At last, the alley opened into a courtyard, a quiet square with a dried-up fountain in the middle, and 6 stone benches arranged with suspicious symmetry. The man gestured for Lucius to sit. "This," he said, "is where the watchers watch each other. Once every few weeks, the threads gather. We do not speak here. We record. Record what Lucius asked." "Presence," the man replied. "Stillness. Silence. It's not about hearing. It's about who can sit and be unseen while in full view. You've interrupted the rhythm, but that can be useful too. Sit." Lucius obeyed. The stone was cold, the kind that remembered previous occupants and judged them. One by one, others arrived. Some he recognized from the theater, others not. Each wore the thread. No one spoke. No one gestured. They simply took their places on the benches or leaned against the fountain's crumbling edge. It was like watching a meeting where nothing was allowed to happen. No nods, no signals, not even a shared glance. Just presence. Lucius began to understand. This wasn't communication in the traditional sense. This was calibration. Observers being observed to ensure the observers could still observe. A loop of mutual scrutiny so taut that no words were needed. After some time, he couldn't tell how long the sun had fully sunk now, and the shadows moved like reluctant ink. A faint chime rang out, not loud, just a soft metal tap against stone. Heads turned toward the sound briefly in sync. A woman stepped into the courtyard barefoot, her wrists bare, her robe plain. She carried no scroll, no seal, no fruit. She walked to the center of the fountain's rim and raised her hand. Then she extended 2 fingers and lowered them. Some of the watchers stood and left. Not quickly, not urgently, just with the quiet purpose of people who had completed their line on a page. Lucius remained seated. The man who had brought him leaned over, finally whispering, "You were not chosen tonight, but you were seen. That matters." "By whom?" Lucius asked. "By those who choose," he said. "They have names, but they rarely use them. Mostly they prefer symbols. Tonight's was the dove. The woman." "No," the man said. "The signal." Lucius exhaled slowly. His fingers found the edge of the gray cloth on his wrist and pressed it like one might a wound to test if it still stung. "What happens now?" "You'll be given something," the man said. "A tool. A key. Maybe even a question. You'll carry it. Not far. But importantly, more boxes. Possibly. Or words. Sometimes a word can weigh more than lead." The remaining watchers dispersed in 2s and 3s, some vanishing into stairwells, others blending into the alleys as if painted onto the walls. Lucius stood. The man did not follow. "You go east now," he said. "Find the lantern with 3 wicks. Enter the building behind it. There you'll receive your item. They'll call you Densus. That's tonight's name. Answer to it." "And tomorrow?" Lucius asked. "Tomorrow is too far ahead," the man said. "Capax was your test. Densus is your function." Lucius nodded once, then turned and left the courtyard, back into the veins of Rome, following only instinct and the slow rhythm of watchfulness that now pulsed behind every surface. Ahead, somewhere in the clutter of narrow streets and unlit thresholds, a lantern burned with 3 wicks, and a purpose he had yet to understand. Lucius, no longer quite. Lucius still. Partly Capax, and now newly christened Densus. For the evening, a name that felt like a placeholder, for a role he hadn't rehearsed, navigated the alleys with a kind of second-hand confidence, the kind borrowed from someone who once knew the way, but no longer cared if they got there on time. The city had softened under the weight of darkness, its corners rounded by shadows, its rooftops whispering quietly among themselves, as if debating whether to remember the day just past. He turned left at a fig stall, now closed the fruit sleeping under a net, and then again down a passage that smelled of wet plaster and sage. Ahead, a lantern burned. Not just any lantern, but the one he had been told to find triple wicked, shaped like a small brazier, with metal arms holding its flames apart, like a cautious agreement between fire and air. The building behind it looked unassuming, which was perhaps its most remarkable feature. 2 stories, faded shutters, a door that creaked not with age, but with deliberation. Lucius stepped forward, tapped once on the wood, then pushed it open. Inside, the air shifted cooler, but not from lack of warmth. It was the coolness of intention, of thresholds of places meant to hold secrets gently, without bruising them. The entryway led to a narrow corridor lined with shallow alcoves, each one holding an item: a vase, a sandal, a folded cloth, a stylus snapped in half. Nothing was labeled. Everything was deliberate. A man waited at the far end, seated behind a table made of pale wood and covered in a cloth that shimmered faintly despite the low light. He looked up, blinked slowly, and said, "Densus." Lucius nodded. "Present." The man stood, moved to a small chest beside him, and withdrew a bundle wrapped in linen. "This is your item," he said. "You will not open it. You will not speak of it. You will carry it to the atrium near the Temple of Concord. You will place it in the niche beside the second column on the west wall. You will leave immediately. If anyone speaks to you, you are lost. If anyone follows you, drop the bundle and walk away. And if I deliver it successfully," Lucius asked, "then tomorrow you will be someone else," the man replied, "and you will carry something new." The bundle was handed over. It was light, barely more than a whisper in his hands, yet it felt dense somehow, like it had chosen to contain something important, simply out of politeness. He tucked it into the inner fold of his tunic, securing it with the strip of gray cloth still tied at his wrist. The man at the table said nothing more. Lucius exited the building, the lantern's 3 wicks still flickering in quiet agreement above him, and turned toward the Temple of Concord. The streets had thinned now. Fewer voices, fewer footsteps, just the occasional cart rolling lazily across uneven stone and the murmur of fountains trying not to be noticed. He moved steadily, not quickly, remembering the man's instructions. No talking, no answering, no acknowledgement. The bundle pressed against his ribs like a heartbeat that didn't belong to him. The Temple of Concord loomed ahead, its columns catching the moonlight in narrow seams, its steps worn smooth by centuries of decisions and regrets. The atrium beside it was half forgotten, rarely used a space where pigeons congregated in silent judgment, and bureaucrats occasionally stepped aside to draft quieter compromises. Lucius slipped into the atrium's shadow, counted the columns, found the second on the west wall, and approached. The niche was there, barely visible. A small hollow in the stone, shaped not quite like a shelf, not quite like a shrine. He reached in, placed the bundle, gently withdrew his hand, and stepped back. 1 breath, 2. Then he turned and walked away. No one stopped him. No one followed, but as he exited the atrium, he caught the faintest scent of oil and clay. Someone had just extinguished a lamp. Someone had watched. He did not look back. Instead, he retraced his steps, taking a different route, now circling through a side street lined with closed bathhouses and sleeping cats. When he arrived back at the building behind the 3-wicked lantern, the door was closed, but the light was out. He stood for a moment, unsure whether to knock, then noticed a small slip of parchment pinned to the lintel. He reached up, pulled it down. On it, a name Surtor, and beneath it, a word, prepare. Lucius No Densus folded the parchment and tucked it into his belt beside the empty pouch from earlier. He looked up at the darkened lantern. The flame was gone. The roll had ended. A new one awaited. The city yawned before him, rooftops huddled in thought walls, breathing slowly. Somewhere nearby, a fig cart rolled over loose cobblestone, unnoticed, and down the street, a voice began to hum a melody without words. He didn't know if the voice humming was meant for him, but it carried in the way that quiet things often do when everything else has gone silent. Lucius, now bearing the name Surtor, which sounded more like a suggestion than a full identity, let the tune settle behind him as he walked, one hand resting lightly on the parchment still tucked beside his belt. The word prepare had not been followed by instructions, nor by any symbol he recognized. It was bare and unapologetic, like a doorway without hinges. The streets had thinned further, the air turning cooler, not with weather, but with the kind of damp neutrality that arrived when the city no longer expected visitors. He passed a bakery with its shutters, drawn the smell of yeast clinging stubbornly to the walls. He turned left, then right, not with direction, but with instinct, finding himself near a fountain shaped like a lion that had forgotten how to roar. A boy sat nearby, tossing pebbles into the basin, each one landing with a sound smaller than its size. He looked up as Surtor approached and said, without inflection, "You're early." Surtor paused. "I wasn't told when to arrive." "Exactly," the boy replied, rising. He wore a tunic several sizes too large and no shoes. "Follow." They walked in silence, the boy leading with the easy gait of someone who belonged nowhere, and was therefore free to go everywhere. He ducked through an archway covered in ivy, stepped over a drainage channel that smelled faintly of vinegar and chalk, and entered a courtyard. Sir Tor did not recognize, but suspected he had passed before in another life, under another name. In the center stood a single table made of rough stone, low to the ground, surrounded by 6 mismatched chairs. A woman sat in one of them, her fingers tapping a rhythm on the table's edge. A man leaned against a pillar, nearby, eyes closed, but listening. Another figure stood in shadow, face hidden, arms crossed. The boy motioned to an empty seat. Sir Tor took it. The woman stopped tapping. "We've been watching your progress," she said. "You've carried. You've delivered. You've counted. Now we need you to see." Sir Tor waited. "See what patterns," she replied. "Shapes. The way decisions trace themselves across unrelated faces. Tonight, you'll begin the real work." The man against the pillar spoke without opening his eyes. "You'll be given no map, only a word. That word will guide your attention. You'll find it in gestures, in street corners, in the way people lean when they lie." The word Sir Tor asked. "Will be yours," said the figure in the shadows. A hand emerged, holding a tablet no larger than a slice of bread. Sir Tor took it. The surface was blank at first, then shimmered faintly. Letters appeared slowly, carved not by stylus, but by impression, as if the tablet remembered being written upon. The word Obex. He stared at it. Obex. A barrier. An obstacle. A thing that blocks. "What do I do with this?" he asked. The woman stood. "You look for it. You find where it lives, where it hides, where it wears disguises. Report nothing. Change nothing. Just notice. That's all. And when I see it, then," she said, "you'll be ready to carry again." She handed him a satchel, empty, light, marked only with a single dot of blue ink. "This is your observation pouch," she said. "You will place nothing in it. It is a reminder that most things do not need to be kept to be remembered." Sir Tor took the satchel. It felt absurdly weightless. The boy was already walking again, and Sir Tor followed, slipping through a different archway, this time into a street that curved like a question that didn't expect an answer. The city had changed. Or perhaps he had. Every passerby now carried potential. Every motion a paragraph of unspoken text. He passed a man arguing with a crate. Obex num. The crate was winning. He passed 2 women, trading gossip near a shuttered taberna. One nodded too quickly. Obex, possibly. Farther down, a priest picked a fig off the ground and placed it gently on a ledge, whispering something into the air. Surtur paused. Obex. There it was. Not the fruit, not the whisper, but the motion careful to deliberate. A moment of pause not meant for reverence, but for concealment. He moved on, turned right, found himself near the Subura again, where the streets tangled like nervous handwriting, and every window had two purposes. He passed a tavern called the Quiet Laurel. Someone inside sneezed. No one acknowledged it. Obex, perhaps. He rounded another corner. A child chalked circles on a wall, then carefully stepped inside them, 1 foot at a time. Obex. A game, yes, but also a ritual. A pattern meant to contain movement. He watched, noted, walked on. Hours passed like idle coins. The city tilted further into night. The word on the tablet remained glowing faintly, even when tucked into his tunic. When he finally returned to the fountain, the lion still silent, the boy reappeared. "You saw it?" he said. Surtur nodded. "It's everywhere." "Of course it is," the boy said. "The obstacle is never one thing. It's the shape of the road when no one walks it." He handed Surtur a second slip of parchment. A new name, Varro, a new word beneath it. Wait. Surtur capax, densus. Lucius. He no longer flinched at the shedding of names, folded the note, pocketed it, and sat beside the fountain. The stone was still cold. The night still listening. Somewhere not far off, a fig dropped from a tree and struck the earth with a sound too soft to notice. And under the sky's patient stare, he prepared to wait. He didn't expect waiting to feel like anything, but it did. It itched, not physically, but mentally, like a slow, creeping whisper in the back of his thoughts that something was meant to happen, and the delay was not just inconvenient, but profoundly intentional. Lucius, or Surtur, or perhaps now Varro. He had stopped keeping track of which name belonged to which mood, remained seated beside the fountain, where the lion continued to look vaguely insulted by the passage of time. The note still rested in his tunic, folded and warm now from the heat of indecision. The word wait glowed not with light, but with the weight of expectation, and it somehow seemed heavier than carry or observe had ever managed to be. The boy had vanished again, a habit he seemed to practice with frustrating elegance, leaving Varro to measure time in the pattern of nighttime foot traffic and the occasional flutter of pigeons who treated the square as a negotiation between rest and mild paranoia. He waited through what felt like 2 bells, though no chimes rang. Only the subtle shifting of shadow and the arrival of a street cleaner, who paused, frowned at him, and then swept around the fountain as though he were an inconvenient sculpture. At last, a sound, soft, deliberate footsteps, not hurried, not stealthy, simply placed. A woman appeared at the edge of the square, older, with silver hair, pulled back into a knot, and a tunic dyed a blue, so faded it could have once been hopeful. She walked with a staff not from need, but from design, each step accompanied by a soft tap, like punctuation to an invisible sentence. She stopped in front of Varro and regarded him. "Still?" she said. "That's good." "I was told to wait," he replied. "Most people don't," she said. "They wait for a while, then they start to think, and then they act. You didn't act." "Not yet," he said. "Good," she replied again, then extended her hand. In it was a coin, small square bronze, not currency, not even decorative, just marked with a single symbol, a closed eye. "You'll carry this," she said. "Not far, just to a place where silence is kept." "Is it dangerous?" he asked. "All silence is," she said, and then turned, already moving. He followed her, though she did not speak again. They passed through a covered arcade where vines hung like patient spectators, then down 3 stairs, worn thin by forgettable feet. The streets narrowed, the city growing quieter, not in the absence of sound, but in the refusal to speak. At last they stopped in front of a doorway that led beneath the street level, an old granary, perhaps repurposed, reimagined. "Inside," she said, "you'll find a man who does not speak. You'll place the coin in the bowl by his left hand. You won't stay. You won't ask." Varro nodded, took the coin, and entered. The room was cool, lit by a single lantern placed on the floor. The man sat at a table, thin old eyes, closed, hands resting palms up. Beside his left hand, a shallow clay bowl. Varro stepped forward, placed the coin in the bowl, and withdrew. The man did not stir. The lantern flickered once, as if exhaling, and then the room was still again. When Varro returned to the street, the woman was gone. In her place stood a child different from the boy, before younger, holding a folded piece of parchment in both hands, like a gift no one wanted to open. Varro took it. This time there was no name, only a phrase. "Speak to no one for the next 27 steps." He glanced up. The child was already walking. He followed. He did not speak, not on the first step, nor the fifth, not when they passed a woman sweeping her stoop, who seemed to mouth something, a greeting, a warning, nor when a man on the corner dropped a basket and swore softly. Step 17. The child turned sharply down a narrow street. Step 22. They passed a mural of Minerva, painted in colors now lost to the sun. At step 27, the child stopped, turned, and pointed to a doorway. "Here," he said. "Now you may speak." "What is this place?" Varro asked. "It's where they name the unseen things," the child replied. "You'll learn to describe what isn't said. You'll learn to speak with care." He disappeared before Varro could ask anything else. The door was half open. Varro stepped through. Inside was a small chamber lined with shelves, each shelf holding bundles of scrolls marked with single words. Not titles, not topics, just isolated, curious words. Hesitation, thread, fold, refusal. A woman sat behind a desk shaped like a wedge. She looked up. "You're late," she said, though not with disapproval. "Time bends. Sit." He did. She placed a scroll in front of him. Read, repeat, then leave. He unrolled it slowly. The text was brief, a description of a man standing in a doorway, not entering, not leaving, just holding the frame, as if uncertain whether he had been invited or had simply wandered too far into his own thought. Below the passage, a single question. What is this called? Varro thought. Then answered aloud, Obex. The woman smiled. You've been paying attention. She handed him another slip of parchment. This one bore a familiar mark, the fig drawn now, with roots extended, not coiled, but splayed like fingers reaching for something deep. Beneath it, you are ready to return. Tomorrow, you will carry again. But this time, not alone. Varro folded the parchment, tucked it into the inner fold of his tunic, and stepped back into the night. The streets no longer whispered. They waited. The night had grown fuller. Somehow. Not darker, just thicker, with the kind of weight that comes when events have begun to turn from mere moments into a pattern that no longer cares about the shape of your name. Varro, who had been Lucius, who had been Densus Sertor, and briefly Capax, walked the cobbled streets with quiet purpose. The message still tucked in his tunic, pressing softly against his ribs, like a reminder not to hurry. He did not know who would join him, only that he was no longer meant to carry alone. That in itself was a shift. Rome slept, or pretended to. Windows blinked out one by one. Dogs settled into corners shaped like their doubts. From the rooftops came the slow creak of tiles, cooling from a day of passive listening. Varro turned into a smaller lane, one lined with clay walls and creeping vines, where a single candle burned from a second-story window, casting a small, steady glow onto the street below. That was the signal. 3 soft knocks on the door. Not too slow, not too fast. The rhythm of someone who knew they would not be refused. The door opened to reveal a girl, perhaps 16 barefoot, holding a lantern with both hands, as though she feared it might float away. She looked up at him with the practiced calm of someone who had answered many doors and forgotten most of them. "You'll need to wash your hands," she said. "Upstairs. Basin to the left." Varro blinked, but followed ascending a narrow stairwell that curved slightly, the steps worn uneven by too many feet, not committed to any one direction. The basin was indeed to the left. Cold water, scented faintly with rosemary. He dried his hands on a cloth that smelled of ash, then descended again to find the girl waiting in a small parlor filled with scrolls tied shut and marked with the seal of the fig tree. Beside her stood a man with a crooked shoulder and a crooked smile, both equally unbothered. "This is your pair," the girl said. "You'll carry together." "And what are we carrying?" Varro asked. The man chuckled. "Not what, who." The girl stepped aside to reveal a bundle on the floor. Not large, not heavy, but definitely human-shaped beneath the cloth. A body, breathing from what he could tell, slow and even. The man knelt and pulled the covering aside. A boy, 10 perhaps, eyes closed, limbs loose with sleep, or something much like it. He saw too much, the man said too little. So now he goes elsewhere. Alive, Varro asked. For now, the man replied, he's what we call a scroll of silence. You'll deliver him to the archivum at the edge of the Aventine. South gate, door with the broken hinge. Say nothing when you arrive. Just place him in the chair. They'll know. We just walk, like we're taking our nephew to see a doctor, the man said. Not too fast, not too slow. Mid-afternoon pace. You leave before dawn. The girl handed Varro a robe, plain pale, a little too large. For blending, she said. Everyone ignores an uncle in ill-fitting clothes. The man lifted the boy and placed him into a carry sling designed more for baskets than children. He won't speak, he said. But if he does, don't answer. Just nod like you agree." And afterward, Varro asked, "You'll return here," the girl said. "Or not. Depends how the boy arrives." They didn't sleep. There was tea, weak and bracing, and a loaf of bread with more crust than center. The hours passed like old senators, grumbling, slow, slightly bent. When the sky turned pale and uncertain, they wrapped the boy again loosely, gently, and stepped outside. The streets were soft with dew and mostly empty. Only the earliest vendors stirred, murmuring to their stalls, arranging their wares with the solemnity of priests. They walked north at first, then curved west, avoiding the forum, slipping past temples that still held the night in their columns. No one paid them any attention. A child carried in early light, a man beside him, looking tired, but not dangerous. The gates of the Aventine appeared sooner than Varro expected, the hill rising like a slow breath. They climbed in silence. The boy stirred, once mumbled something that might have been a word, or a warning, or a dream about figs. Varro did not answer. The archivum was tucked between two structures that had clearly once been more important. Its door sagged slightly. The hinge bent just enough to make it whisper when opened. Inside, it was cool and lined with shelves that had forgotten what they were meant to hold. A single chair sat in the center, facing a wall that bore no decoration, no message, no memory. Varro stepped forward, placed the boy into the chair. The child did not wake. The man beside him exhaled. "Done," he said. "We leave." They turned without another word, stepping back into the gray of morning's middle breath. Behind them, the door closed with the sound of someone finishing a sentence without looking up. They walked without urgency, taking a different route, one that curved through a district that sold nothing but ink and regret. At a small corner fountain, the man stopped, turned to Varro, and held out his hand. "You carried well," he said. "Better than most. Better than expected." Varro took the hand, felt the press of something past small square, wrapped in waxed cloth. "What's this?" he asked. "A question," the man said. "For later. Not yours to answer. Just to hold. And if someone asks, you'll say it's a gift, and that you haven't unwrapped it yet." Varro nodded. The man stepped back, vanished down an alley framed in ivy and morning bread smoke. Alone now, again, but not empty. Varro turned east. The city was beginning to speak again. Pigeons argued. Children shouted names that would someday change. A fig seller arranged her fruit in rows that meant something only to her, and somewhere far ahead, behind a door not yet knocked, upon someone waited to hand him his next name. Varro walked east, the wrapped square of waxed cloth warm in his palm, its weight too slight for metal, too balanced for coin, and entirely too silent for peace of mind. He tucked it into the fold of his robe without looking at it again, as if acknowledging its presence too directly might cause it to speak, or worse, be noticed by someone whose attention he had not asked for. The streets had shifted again, as they always did, after a delivery, subtly rearranging their rhythms so that familiar corners seemed to pause before revealing themselves. Market stalls began to hum with early customers, men in sandals and tunics cut just above the knee, women with baskets that told stories about their morning plans. Someone was selling small mirrors with no frames. Someone else sold spoons carved with obscure proverbs. Varro passed them without slowing. He moved with the gait of someone who remembered being told where to go, even if he couldn't recall when. His destination, though never spoken aloud, revealed itself in the way a crow circled overhead 3 times before disappearing behind a column in the pattern of sandals outside a closed taberna, in the faint scent of mint trailing through the alley, just west of the Temple of Spes. He arrived at a door half-shadowed by a vine that bore no fruit. This, he had learned, was often a good sign. He knocked once. The door opened, not inward, but outward, a curious detail that made stepping through it feel like leaving rather than entering. Inside, the space was quiet, not empty, but still the kind of stillness that only exists when everyone has agreed not to disturb it. A man sat behind a narrow desk built from old temple beams, and beside him stood a woman holding a wooden box sealed with dark wax. "Varro," the man said, "or whatever version of him you are today." Varro inclined his head. "I've carried. I've watched. I've waited. I've received." "Have you opened?" the woman asked. "Not yet," he said. "Good," she replied. "It's not time. Some things lose their meaning once unwrapped." She placed the box on the table. "This," she said, "is for someone else. You'll take it, but not to them. You'll take it to the one who delivers to them. The chain must remain invisible." "Who is the final recipient?" Varro asked. "Not your concern," the man said. "But if it helps, they no longer remember their name, only their task. And the one I'm to find. She waits in the courtyard of 3 trees," the woman said. "Olive, fig, and almond. No more, no less. She'll be weaving thread. Offer no greeting. Place the box at her left knee. She'll nod. You'll walk away." Varro took the box. It was heavier than it appeared, with a faint scent of something between wax and cinnamon, or perhaps just old parchment with ambition. He bowed slightly, tucked the box beneath his arm, and exited through the same outward opening door, which closed behind him with the soft thud of withheld secrets. The sun was rising now, not aggressively, but with a steady insistence that made shadows lean more sharply. He walked slowly, not because of the weight, but because the city was watching again, the same way a cat watches something it isn't sure whether to chase or ignore. He passed a fountain shaped like a lion devouring a scroll. He passed a man drawing birds in chalk on the side of a grain silo. He passed a baker who offered him bread with a nod, and then withdrew it just before the exchange could happen. All part of the pattern. At last, he found the courtyard, small, round, tucked between buildings that whispered different architectural languages to each other. 3 trees, precisely 1 olive, its leaves silvery in the morning light. 1 fig sturdy and deliberate, and 1 almond already shedding blossoms like unspoken confessions. A woman sat on a low stool, weaving thread onto a frame in a pattern too intricate to be decorative. She did not look up. Varro approached, paused, and placed the box at her left knee. She nodded once, and he turned away. But just as he stepped toward the gate, she spoke not loudly, not urgently, but in a voice that paused the morning. "You're still carrying it." He stopped. The square. "The question," she said. "You've felt it, haven't you? Its shape shifting while it waits." He did not answer. She looked up, at last her eyes pale but firm. "Don't unwrap it yet. But do not forget you hold it." "What is it?" he asked. "A possibility," she replied, "and possibly a warning, or possibly both." She returned to her weaving. He walked on. The sky had brightened to a pale gold, now the air warming with the promise of ordinary errands and slow carts. Varro walked toward a street he didn't remember learning, but which his feet recognized. And as he passed beneath a hanging banner announcing a fictional festival for a saint who had never existed, he felt the square shift slightly in his robe. Not heavier, just closer. He did not touch it. Not yet. But ahead, a boy stood, holding another parchment, and Varro knew, before the boy even opened his mouth, that it would contain a name. And that name, once again, would be his. The pony stood with that curious stillness known only to messengers and statues. Arms folded politely, eyes just shy of direct, and posture balanced somewhere between patience and mild existential inconvenience. As Varro approached, The boy extended the parchment without ceremony. And though neither smiled, the exchange had the familiar weight of ritual, as though both were fulfilling obligations older than names. The parchment was smooth, folded, twice sealed, not with wax, but with thread gray, of course knotted, once, then looped the kind of knot that unraveled easily if one knew where to pull. Varro untied it with deliberate care and read the name inside Ebor, a name like dust or forgotten cities, or perhaps both. Beneath it, a phrase, "Carry the silence until it speaks." He folded the parchment and tucked it beside the waxed square he still carried, the one that hadn't asked for attention, but increasingly demanded it by doing absolutely nothing at all. The boy had already disappeared, as was customary, though the faintest echo of sandals against cobble suggested he had turned left. Varro did not follow. Instead, he walked forward into a street where the shade clung a little longer than it should have, and the stones bore faint traces of symbols brushed in water that would evaporate by mid-morning. The silence he was now instructed to carry was not the boy's, nor the woman's, nor even the city's. It was his. A stillness imposed, but now assigned an object in itself. He didn't know what shape it would take or how it would announce its intention, but he was to bear it nonetheless. He passed a woman selling ribbon from a tray suspended around her neck. Each strand dyed a color with a name more elaborate than its hue deserved. He passed a barber sweeping the steps of his stall with more pride than customers. He passed a goat tethered loosely to a bench beside a statue of Neptune with only one arm, all of them part of the tapestry, none of them aware that a man named Ebor was now among them, tasked with the burden of nothing at all. Near the edge of the Tiber, where the banks curved like sleeping serpents, and the air always smelled faintly of overripe reeds, he found the spot suggested by the name's rhythm, an overgrown atrium, with a broken mosaic and a bench shaped like an eyelid. No one waited. That too seemed appropriate. He sat placing his hands on his knees, the square in his tunic pressing gently against his ribs. The silence was immediate. Not the absence of noise, Rome never gave that, but the pause between layers of noise, a hollow fold where expectation lived. A cart rattled past at a distance. A crow cawed once, as if for bookkeeping. A child laughed somewhere too far to matter. And still, within all of it, Ebor held the silence. It did not speak. Not yet. He sat for the better part of an hour, though it could have been more or less time bent strangely around tasks without deadlines. At last, a figure approached. A man older, wrapped in a cloak made from two mismatched halves of other cloaks. His face was familiar, though Ebor could not place why. Perhaps because it resembled the statues lining the lesser basilicas, or perhaps because it was the kind of face one remembered forgetting. The man did not speak. He simply sat beside him on the eyelid-shaped bench and extended his hand. Ebor did not place anything in it. Instead, he turned slightly, met the man's eyes, and said, "The silence has not spoken." The man withdrew his hand, nodded once, and reached into his own tunic. From it, he drew a small bundle wrapped in fabric that bore the scent of ink and dried time. He placed it between them, then stood and left his sandals, making no more noise than a broom's passing. Ebor did not open the bundle. That he understood now was not the point. Things were past, not unwrapped. Questions were held, not asked. Words were carried, not spoken. He took the bundle, placed it in his satchel, beside the waxed square, and rose. A new weight now pressed at his side, not oppressive, but layered like syllables, building toward a sentence that had not yet been agreed upon. He walked north this time, away from the river, into a district where the buildings leaned a little too closely to one another, as if gossiping or bracing against some invisible breeze. The streets narrowed. Names here were whispered, more than posted shops, marked with chalk that faded and reappeared depending on the hour. He turned left at a door with 3 locks and right at a statue missing both feet. Eventually, he came to a gate made of reeds woven into iron, a contradiction, but a practiced one. The gate opened as he reached for it, and behind it stood a woman with hair like coiled ink and eyes that seemed to know. "Ebor," she said, "you've held it long enough. Time to place it." "Where?" he asked. "Not far," she said, "but not with your hands. That part is done." She stepped aside, revealing a table made of stone and shaped like a question mark if viewed from above. On it sat 3 vessels, 1 bronze, 1 glass, 1 made of some material that defied labeling. "Place it in the one that calls to you," she said. "Don't think. Just listen." Ebor reached into his tunic, withdrew the square of waxed cloth, held it in both hands. It was warm, slightly firmer than before, as though the question had ripened. He placed it in the glass vessel without knowing why. The moment it touched the base, the room seemed to pause, not dramatically, not loudly, just slightly, like a breath held between thoughts. The woman smiled. "Now it can be asked?" "By whom?" Ebor said. "By the one who already knows the answer," she said, "but who needed to wait for the right question." "And me?" he asked. "What do I carry now?" She walked to a shelf, took down a small parchment folded into the shape of a bird, and handed it to him. This time, a direction, not a name. Read it only when your shadow is shorter than your hand. Ebor bowed, tucked the parchment away, and stepped back into the morning. His steps lighter now, but still unhurried. The silence no longer weighed on him. It had found its voice, and he in turn would carry whatever sound came next. Ebor did not check the sun immediately. He walked. The parchment folded into a bird rested in his tunic, like a dormant thought, its wings slightly crinkled from being handled too carefully. He passed into a part of the city that always felt a few degrees removed from consensus, where no street had a clear end, and most doors pretended they weren't doors at all. The rooftops were lower here, the walls narrower, and the alleys seemed to fold in on themselves, as if the city had decided to breathe inward for a while. At one point, he stopped at a baker's stall, with no bread, but a sign that read, "Closed, but only for customers," and paused under the overhang. He raised his hand, palm flat, casting a shadow against the wall, longer than his fingers. Not yet. He moved on. The sun climbed with that quiet confidence known only to objects that do not require acknowledgement. Ebor passed under a wooden arch shaped like a fishbone and into a courtyard surrounded by jars of all sizes, clay and glass, some sealed, some open, some empty, by design. A woman was sleeping on a rug near the largest one, her feet bare, her fingers twitching in rhythm with a dream. He did not disturb her. He moved to the far end of the courtyard, where a narrow path slipped through two buildings, barely on speaking terms, and emerged into a clearing paved with tesserae that formed the shape of a compass missing all but one direction. East. The only way forward. The shadow now had shortened. He stopped, turned his hand again. It aligned. The sun was near its apex. The parchment was ready. He unfolded the bird gently, the creases released with a sigh. Inside, a single phrase: "Walk east until you find the place where time doubles back." Vague, yes, but not unhelpful. In Rome, time doubled back regularly, sometimes in the form of conversations, sometimes in stones, reused, sometimes in memories, left out for others to trip over. Ebor turned east, letting his feet find the rhythm, his thoughts loosening. He walked past a weaver's shop, where no one wove, past a dog grooming itself with the intensity of a philosopher reconsidering everything, past a wall where someone had written in charcoal, "Forgive the roads. They are tired, too." He turned at the statue of Mercury, missing his caduceus, and into a lane where shadows overlapped strangely, creating pools of dimness out of sync with the time of day. Time was bending here, maybe. He walked slower. At a corner, a child played with a top that spun counterclockwise but moved forward. A man nearby watched it with admiration or concern. It was hard to tell. Ybor turned again, not by design, but by instinct. And there it was, a square not large, not small, where the stones bore mismatched inscriptions, some dated forward, others backward. A public sundial stood crooked in the center, its gnomon bent not by accident, but as though it had leaned toward some secret too long. He stopped. A bench nearby was empty, save for a folded cloth. A woman approached, older, her stride, slow face, familiar in the way long-held stories are. She carried no object, no scroll, but walked with the confidence of someone whose directions always made sense after the fact. She nodded at Ybor, then at the cloth. "You're to take that," she said. "Not carry it, just unfold it." He stepped forward. The cloth was heavier than expected, and embroidered with a map, hand-stitched, imperfect, with roads that shifted if stared at too long. No legend, no names, just lines and crossings and the occasional stitch in red. "Where does it lead?" he asked. "It doesn't," she replied. "It reflects. It shows where you've already been." "But I know where I've been," he said. "Do you?" She asked with a kind look that implied she hoped he would be right. He studied the map. The red threads highlighted places, some he recognized: the collapsed theater, the atrium of silence, the bench shaped like an eyelid. But others puzzled him. A stairwell he didn't remember, a narrow bridge, a small room labeled only with the glyph of a closed eye. "Some places remember you, even if you forget them," the woman said. "Today you'll revisit one. It's marked here." She pointed to a corner stitched in black thread, barely visible unless the light caught it. "What's there?" he asked. "A door," she said. "Or a window, depending on how you look." "And what do I do?" "Wait," she said. "But this time, you listen while you do." Ybor folded the map, tucked it under his arm, and looked east again. The stones beneath him hummed slightly now, like the city was exhaling through its joints. He walked through the square, past the sundial, that still refused to cast a straight shadow, and down a lane where vines grew from walls too dry to explain their existence. The map grew warmer in his hand the closer he came to the black threaded mark. At last he arrived. A wall. Plain stone, unremarkable, except for a single mark etched at shoulder height. A line broken once in the middle. A pause. He stood before it. Nothing happened. But then again, he had not yet listened. He stood before the wall, and let the quiet settle. Like dust around his shoulders, the map folded neatly beneath his arm, its warmth now steady rather than rising. The mark on the wall, just a simple line with a pause, looked like it had been etched with care and mild regret, the way a person might underline a sentence they both believe and fear. Ebor, still wearing the last of his borrowed name, placed his hand near the mark, but did not touch it. That seemed important. He had been told to wait and to listen, and though the city offered no silence, it did provide layers. Pigeons shuffling on a rooftop, the clink of pottery in a nearby window, and the strange melodic creak of a door that was not his. But beneath it all, something deeper, a rhythm too slow for a heartbeat, too measured for footsteps. The wall itself was humming just faintly, like a thought being remembered. He leaned closer, eyes half closed, not to see better, but to subtract his vision from the equation, to make space for the other senses. That's when the air changed. Not the temperature, not the scent, but the shape of it. He stepped back, just as a seam appeared along the stone's edge, vertical, precise opening inward, without a sound. No hands, no hinges, no invitation, just the presence of passage. Ebor entered. The room beyond was round, smaller than expected, the ceiling low, with walls lined in what first appeared to be scrolls, but closer inspection revealed they were not. They were records, yes, but not of writing. Rows upon rows of soft fabric-wrapped bundles, each tagged with a symbol, a tooth, a grain, a feather, a raindrop. None repeated. A table sat in the center, made of wood, so old it looked like pressed ash. On it, a single object, a small box, lidless, empty, except for a folded piece of red cloth. He did not touch it. The cloth, despite its stillness, exuded something not unlike intent. The room made no demands. No figures emerged. No voice spoke from the corners. It was simply present and expectant. Ebor placed the map on the table beside the box, and for a moment, nothing changed. Then slowly, as though responding to a cue, only it could hear the red cloth unfolded by itself. Not with magic, with memory. It spread into the shape of a square, its edges revealing stitch patterns that echoed the city's layout, but slightly altered, as if drawn from a memory of Rome that predated Rhodes. And in the center, a mark he recognized the closed eye, the same as the bronze coin from the silent man's table, the same as the Nike near the temple of Concord. It pulsed now, not with light, but with certainty. Ebor reached forward and placed his palm gently in the center of the cloth. The room exhaled. The walls trembled once, not violently, but like someone remembering the name of a lost friend. The cloth warmed beneath his hand, and the pulse steadied, sinking to his breath. Something unseen shifted. And then, as simply as one step following another, a drawer opened in the table. Inside, a single strip of parchment, rolled and tied with a thread of gold, an unusual flourish in a story that had favored the gray and the ordinary. He took it. The thread unspooled easily, revealing a short message written in a hand he had seen once before on a message carried by a child he could no longer name. You are no longer the carrier. You are the question. Ebor did not move. He reread the line. Once, then again, a third time. Each reading changed nothing, but it deepened his stillness. The question, not the answer, not the message, not even the watcher. The question, a role so central it disguised itself. He looked again at the cloth. It had begun to fade, not disappear, just dim, like a fire deciding whether it was finished. He left it there, along with the map, along with the box, and exited the room. The seam closed behind him, vanishing, as if it had never known how to be open. Outside, the sun had begun to descend, and his shadow was long again, taller than his outstretched hand, stretching ahead like a ribbon of suggestion. The city around him was unchanged in shape, but not in tone. It vibrated differently now, as though having whispered his name when he wasn't listening. He walked. He did not know where, and it no longer mattered. A man passed, carrying a tray of marbled eggs dyed with herbs. A girl leaned from a balcony and dropped a note that fluttered like a bird with no interest in flight. An old woman pulled water from a well that had never gone dry. And Ebor, who had carried the silence, held the square followed the mark, and now stood unknowingly at the center of a question yet to be asked, simply walked on unnoticed, unburdened, and deeply wonderfully not done.